School in Africa, and in Africa I am, but not in South Africa. Today I'm calling you from Rabat in Morocco, and it's an absolute delight to be welcoming you and to welcome our guests. Jean Boulton, Dr. Jean Boulton, who I'm going to ask her to introduce herself a little bit in a moment, and Dr. Sharon Varney, both celebrated authors of books on complexity. I'm really looking forward to this. I'm just going to give you a bit of my backstory on complexity. Actually, I did an MBA in Ashridge in the dawn of time. And straight after the MBA, I decided I'd like to do some teaching. You know, they say, teach what you want to learn. So I went along to a local college nearby and asked if I could teach on the strategy program. And I met this man called Professor Ralph Stacey. I didn't know who Ralph was at all. So he let me teach. And it turns out that Ralph is a South African in the UK. And Jean is going to tell you a little bit in a moment about some other South Africans in the UK who are great complexity theorists. And it turns out that he was a leading light in complexity theory and one of the early authors in the field of complexity theory. And he allowed me to teach in his program, and I started reading his material, and I was blown away by his books. In fact, when I came to South Africa to teach, his book, Ordinary and Extraordinary Management, was my set book for the MBA, and he was a visiting lecturer as well. And I had this wonderful experience of going to a complexity seminar with him in London, with all the boffins from the Santa Fe Institute, like John Holland and Murray Gell-Mann, who wrote Quark and the Jaguar, Nobel Prize winners. And they were talking all about complexity theory. And then Ralph went up on stage and drew sort of causal loop diagrams about anxiety and how it affected anxiety on management. I remember these Nobel scientists almost rolling their eyes and kind of, I don't know what's going on. But of all the talks that day, Ralph's was by far to me the most compelling. And so it's an absolute pleasure that I'm going to be able to moderate this. And thank you so much for coming. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to very quickly, instead of me giving all the backstory about Jean, who's written a wonderful book, and here is Jean's book, by the way, The Tao of Complexity. There's just hit the bookshelves, and I'm going through it. It's absolutely fascinating. And Sharon's also written a wonderful book, which I think Jean has got. I might show it to you. There was Sharon's written that book, Leadership and Complexity and Change. And so you've got two really great authors here talking about that. So I'm really going to ask, I think I'll start with you, Jean, if I may. Just say a little bit about yourself and where you come from. I know that you've got a PhD in theoretical physics, for example. I used to work with you in British Aerospace and where you're heading up the engineering. So a little bit about yourself, and then maybe just kindly answer a simple question. What is complexity? Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, John. Well, good evening. Good afternoon, everybody. It's very nice to be here with Sharon and John and you all. So thank you very much for coming. I'm Jean Boulton. I've been entranced and working in this field of complexity since probably the mid-1990s, which sounds like an awfully long time ago. I worked with Professor Peter Allen at Cranfield University. Peter Allen used to work with Ilya Prigogine, who got the Nobel Prize for work in this field in the 1970s. And we wrote a book, Embracing Complexity, in 2015. And I really feel that embracing complexity, understanding and accepting the complexity of the world is a very important part of being effective, of actually living and working effectively in the world. And as John said, I've just written another book called The Tao of Complexity, which looks at the resonance between complexity thinking and Taoism, which is an ancient philosophy from the 5th century BC, which is another story in itself. But before I answer the question of what is complexity, maybe I can just ask my colleague here, Sharon, to introduce herself too.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, John. Delighted to be here with all of you. I can still remember bumping into complexity. So 20 years ago, I was studying for a master's degree because I was on a corporate career path, and I thought my next job would be benefited from a master's. So I wasn't intending to bump into complexity, but I did. I opened a book, Images of Organisation by Gareth Morgan, back in the late 90s, his book, came across complexity theory, thought, oh my goodness, this is how the world really works. So I'm a practitioner. I've spent my life working in large, complex, global organizations. I was VP for International Learning and Development at a US bank, and then I moved into the energy sector. I was working in engineering and construction. So it really hit me. That's how the world works. Where are all the practical tools that I can use as a senior manager in my organization to pick up on complexity? So 20 years later, I think, now we are much better equipped, and that's really what took me to Henley Business School first of all, was to try and discover that, and really sharing that in my book and also in all of my practice. So that's where I bumped into complexity. Also bumped into Ralph Stacey and asked him, where are these books I want to read?
Yes. And we bumped into each other, didn't we, about 20 years ago as well, at a conference, I remember. Sharon, why don't you go first and answer this tiny question? What do we mean when we talk about complexity? What is it you're saying?
Yeah, you said to start with an easy one, John, but this is actually it's a really challenging one. And, I think often people think that complexity means that something is extra complicated. But actually, complexity is a different animal altogether. And I think that's really, really important. So for me, there are two things that I think we all need to know and need to understand about complexity. The first one is that things are entangled. So if I'm working on something, it's entangled with what you're working on in the same organization, what's going on outside. So if we're dealing with a complex challenge, like a change challenge or a social challenge, we can't just break those challenges down into parts, pick up a part, do something smart with it, and put that part back in. We have to engage with complexity as a whole. But I think a lot of people know this kind of idea of things are connected and entangled. But the second thing that everyone needs to know about complexity, I think this is really interesting, and not as many people seem quite aware of it. And that is that complexity is always changing. So practically, that means that, these complex challenges and the complexity involved, it doesn't stand still while we try and get to grips with it. So if we're kind of trying to engage with the entanglement and map it out, while we're doing that, it's actually changing. So we've got to also engage with that continuing changing. So when I'm trying to explain complexity to people, I often say, well, complexity and change, they come as a package, and that's important to know. And I talk about it as dynamic patterning, because that helps us to keep the idea of changing in mind, that dynamism, at the same time as we talk about the entanglement, the patterning, and how that is changing. So if you haven't come across complexity before, I hope this gives you a little edge in, and I'm sure Jean will add a huge amount to that.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, Jean, let's go straight into you. What do you think complexity is?
So I'd like to pick up on two of those words, patterning and dynamic. Just to peel back a little bit, there is a science of complexity. This is saying more than, my mum used to look at me bewildered ever so often and say, tell me again what complexity is. And then she'd look at me and sort of say words to the effect of, do they pay you to explain this to people? You know, isn't it, you know, in a sense, are you just saying the world's complex, so what? But we're not saying that. There is a science of complexity, which helps us to understand the nature of the complex world so that we can be skillful in actually working with that complexity. And I want to illustrate this idea of dynamic patterning by thinking, first of all, about a family. So if you think about a family has the characteristics of in the scientific sense of being complex, in that it has open boundaries. You know, a family doesn't have closed boundaries where nothing can go in and out. People go to school and to work, you know, there's a new baby, grandma comes to live, you know, the dog dies, you know, there's a kind of movement in these boundaries of the family. But nevertheless, over time, through the interactions and reflexive interactions, that is often repeating patterns of behavior and interaction, you start to find norms in the behavior of a family. So if I come to tea at your house, how you go about things, who talks, you know, who serves the food, whether people sit at the table, will be different in every family. We have norms and patterns of behavior that tend to sustain. And the real paradoxical thing of what Sharon was saying, the paradox, and this is a strong word that comes in complexity thinking, is that the change, the sort of dynamics of that kind of constant interweaving of interactions is what creates the stability of the patterns. So there's a sort of paradox that it's the very change and a movement that can create some sense of stability. So that's the first thing to say. And the important thing about thinking about a family is that it's the same. If you think about a society, it's got people in it interacting. There can be emerging norms of relationships and behavior. If you think about an economy, if you think about an organization, and actually, interestingly, if you think about the way galaxies develop and sustain, it's the same. So this idea of open boundaries, patterns that often remain in place, but sometimes they unravel. So you've got this idea of the what Prigogine talked about, of things always becoming. You can't say this is it now, this is fixed. Now, one of the questions about these patterns that we're talking about is there are times, and you can think of this in families, you know, when things become very rigid. Maybe you have very fixed relationships, very fixed ways of doing things. I used to despair about my parents when they got older, that, you know, they had coffee at 10:30 a.m. and, you know, they did the vacuuming on a Wednesday afternoon, and my father had to do the vacuuming and my mother did the dusting. You know, it became quite a rigid pattern. Sometimes in families, you get quite a kind of flowing, flexible pattern. So, you know, if you've got a kind of really vibrant, flexible patterning in your family or organization, when if there's a disaster, the family can cope. You know, if the house burns down, the dynamics don't fall apart. They can pull together. Or if somebody's very ill, they can pull together. So there's a sort of flexibility, a breathing of those patterns. And sometimes, and we've all been, we all know families like that, they can be very chaotic. So we need to understand the nature of the complex world, but the underlying idea that it's all created by things interacting in reflexive ways, in a dynamic way, is what's at the heart of complexity thinking. And that all comes from the science of it, from the sort of physics and biology originally in particular. But it's very useful to have that image in our head, that kind of world view, when we then go on to think about, well, what do we do about the global stage? What do we do in our organizations? What's leadership? Which is, yes, I'll pass you back to Jon.
Thank you very much. But I'm going to stick with you, Jean. I'll tell you for a very good reason. because you've got the sort of global, your book's written about the global view of that. And I just want to sidetrack for a second, just to tell all the listeners that you've got a chat box there, which you can put down questions as you feel, and we'll come to them a little later. But do put down questions as you go through. You see that chat at the bottom there? It just says chat. Click on that and type in there, and we'll pick those up later. I think there's, I can't see a Q. There's a Q&A box there as well, so we'll be monitoring both of them. And I see Gemma, you've already put one up there. I'm not going to answer that just yet, but thank you. Gemma has led the way. Thank you very much for that. So that's really interesting, and you touched on the broad understanding of the nature of the world there, and then of course you led into the fact that you know, why is this useful for us? Because it's useful for us to try and think of ways in which we can cope and, well, not to manage it, but you know, try and find outcomes of, even if they're emergent in our world. How do we get outcomes in a world that is really so difficult? And what are the limitations of our current way of thinking? Now, your book's pretty amazing, Jean. I'm not trying to flatter you, but it's good. It's already been picked up, you know, in a short time it's been out, and lots of excellent recommendations. You talk about Taoism, you talk about machine thinking, you talk about quantum physics, you talk about so many other things in there. And you come from a theoretical physics background. That's your PhD, and then also aerospace manufacturer. I know you from that. So you've got a very broad church, if you want to, of knowledge. So what I'm really interested in, you know, on a global stage, you cover a lot of ground, but what are some of the big global themes in your book? What's your book about, and why is it important? That's what I would like to say.
Well, it is a very broad-ranging book, as you say, John, and I look at what I've called resonance with other philosophies. So in a way, you know, is complexity just a bit of an idea? You know, how can we say that the world is complex and understand what that means? And one of the themes in the book is that I look at brain science. I look at some of the political writers who've lived through difficult regimes and the way they unpick the complexity of the change processes in their regimes. I look at quantum gravity, believe it or not, in the appendix. I did put it in the appendix, so I didn't frighten everybody off. What I found is that there's a lot of resonance between a lot of different ways of looking at the world, process philosophies, pragmatism. And I'm sort of inviting you in the book to say, don't believe me, but look at all these different experientially based practical ways of understanding the world. It's called a kind of naturalistic metaphysics, an experiential way of understanding things. They have very similar ideas about the way patterns, the plasticity of the brain, the way patterns are created and then shift into something else. So there's something here, guys, you know, that's worth looking at. To answer the specific question about, I do the last section of the book is about how do we understand, you know, what does this have anything to say to us if we're looking at the global stage? And one of the things I really feel about, I've also taught in a business school and I work in a social sciences department. So I have done a lot of consultancy work for organisations too. But one of the questions that is really important, and one of the frames I want to make two or three little points here, is that whatever it is you're doing, you might be an organisation, you might be a fast FMCG company thinking about going into a new market. You might be worrying about infant health and wondering about, you know, what kind of public policy initiatives are needed. Whatever it is you're looking at, you might be looking at food security in your local region. Whatever you're looking at, it's important to do what we've called apprehending the whole entangled interweaving of everything. So the first thing to do is to not constrain your understanding of this complex picture too early. So if you're an economist, what was the biggest thing to happen to the economy in 2020? It was the pandemic. You know, that things are interwoven. If you're looking at infant health, you're going to have to look at housing, you're going to have to look at maternal health, you're going to have to look at food. So whatever it is you're looking at, the apprehending process is to say, think widely and deeply, you know, keep going, ask lots of people, you know, do it with a group of people, read stuff, you know, keep looking at the whole, and then start to do some mapping exercises that then say, well, what's really there? What's really important? How do things interconnect? Are there any vicious circles or virtuous circles? And out of that mapping exercise, you might then start to say, you know what, I'm working in infant health. I think it's absolutely critical that we look at education around health, or I think it's absolutely critical that the real thing that strikes us all looking at this picture is food security, you know. So it allows you, by looking at this kind of mapping exercise, to start to say what really matters. So that's the first thing I would say when you're looking at the global. It's a very practical way of understanding those kind of trying to hone in on those patterns. Another thing to say is that whatever it is you think you know, as Sharon said, it's going to be changing. So as well as mapping, analysing, apprehending, you know, asking questions, trying to clarify what is, you've also got to have processes of noticing what is changing. I did a big piece of work a few years ago looking at why the drought in Northeast Africa in 2000 and I think it was 2011, so quite a while ago, why wasn't it called until it was very late? You know, why weren't people noticing? And that's a lot to do with building trusted relationships with people who live there. You know, it's not waiting that the quantifiable, by the time you quantify a drought, as many of you will know better than me, you know, it's because the people are dying and the cattle are dead, and it's too late. So how do we start to apprehend and notice these tiny shoots of change? How do we institute in our processes these kind of noticings of change? So you've got this kind of look big picture, start to see what's there, look at the patterns, look at the critical vicious and virtuous circles, and then use that as a way to decide what to do. So there's lots more I could say, but let me leave it there, and we can always come back to a broader answer.
Well, thank you. That's absolutely intriguing. What I'm getting from that too is the fact that, you know, by noticing and being aware, and by looking for emergent properties, you're starting to also get some prescience, some sense of what's emerging much earlier than you might otherwise, which is so important in these really complex days, and what a meta skill to evolve. But let's come to you, Sharon, and your book, I think, is really focused more on the working world. You know, it's more explicitly on what people do and why and how they handle it. So what advice do you have for practicing managers in handling the complexities that they encounter every day, which are also wrapped up in mega other complexities that, you know, we often don't engage with? What's your advice? I think we hear that.
It's a great question. It blows my mind that complexity goes up to a galaxy level. You know, when Jean says the world really is complex, she's coming from a physics point of view, and you know there is no end to complexity, and you know there's nothing too small. We're complex as human beings as well. It blows my mind in a good way. It also blows my mind in a way that sometimes that can be a little bit terrifying. And you know, I think in the working world, if we're a manager, we've got kind of expectations of leadership, you know, we've got to do stuff and we've got to get stuff done. And so we're you know, on the one hand, we have the world really is complex. It's not an alternative. It's just always there. But I think the fundamental choice is between trying to engage with real world complexity or pretending it's not there and ignoring it. And, you know, actually, there was a really great question that somebody from Henley Africa posted on LinkedIn the other day, which is, are leaders more effective if they ignore the complexities of life and drive through their goals? And I think this is really, really critical. So, you know, just for all of you there, you know, everybody's on this call, What do you think? You know, are you more effective if you ignore the complexities of life and drive through your goals? In some ways, it's a bit of a binary. It's kind of, you know, it's a little bit yes or no, you know, to a large extent. Do I engage with complexity, or do I ignore it? And I think, you know, it's just an everyday challenge. So kind of in the things that we're saying and doing and the decisions that we're making, that's the point. Do I engage with real world complexity, or do I focus and ignore it? And you know, you'll probably guess that I'm more towards the engaging with complexity. And the reason for that is, if we ignore complexity, it doesn't go away. It's just that we don't see it. So Jean's point about apprehending the complexity, you know, it's like going like this and going, I'll pretend the world's not complex, but it really, really is. And what that sometimes means is, you know, things jump up behind us, and you know, we weren't looking out for it. We didn't see it because we're so focused. So kind of, you know, I'm trying to occupy this middle ground in terms of thinking about complexity of the working world. So, you know, just to bring it to life a little bit, I was thinking about, you know, change projects. This is a place where, you know, I'm sure we can all relate to change projects or initiatives in organisations. Might be an IT system, might be finance, a reorganisation, it might be a new government policy that's coming in, or maybe you have, rather than a project, you're working to improve diversity, equity, inclusion, or knowledge management, or environmental social governance. You've got an intent. You know, there's important work to do to make things better in a general sense. So we've kind of, you know, we've got this intent to do it, and there's a lot facing us in doing that. But the more we focus on what's in front of us, you know, in my change project, the less we notice what's coming in from outside. And I think this is the mindset that would really help us, is pay more attention to the edges. You know, what's it connected to? What is changing in this world? So I think that's actually a very practical thing, Jon, that all of us can do every day, is not focus, just open it up a little bit, look a little bit wider rather than trying to take everything in.
Thanks very much. Sorry, Jean, yeah?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of build a bit on that theme, and I think to emphasize, when we say embrace complexity, it's not saying we have to know everything about everything in order to do anything. As we've tried to say, often when you look at a situation and look at the interconnectivities and map it, things are relatively stable and relatively straightforward. You know, you're looking for what's called the simplicity on the other side of complexity. So it's like sometimes things are relatively straightforward, but you've got the paradox that you've both got to work with the current patterns and the current understanding, and also notice what is unraveling, or what new shoots of change. Because often if you're trying to change things, it's those, where are the nodes, where are the touch points, you know, what's starting to unravel. There, it's noticing. It's as much about noticing as it is about analysing, which is a kind of new idea. And I think it's a really, you know, I think it's a good question. You know, do we just don't bother? You know, if I drive through, you know, do I win? And of course, the answer is you do win in the short term. You know, that there's something that political writers write a lot about, and it's about power. So, you know, if you want to suppress diversity, make people do things in a particular way, then use force, you know, use power, you know, ignore the complexity, make it conform, and you will in your own, you know, as the leader, you will kind of, in a sense, win in the short term, but you won't win in the long term, because you're actually suppressing the entrepreneurial spirit, the adaptability, the flexibility to respond to changing circumstances, the kind of, you know, the natural ability to actually respond by doing that. And you know, it's something at a global level that's a really important issue that I feel, you know, quite strongly about it at the moment. Is inequality is growing around the world, everywhere. The difference within countries and the difference between countries is hugely different. You know, power leads to power. The people who have power and money are able to control the narrative to a very great degree, and they will win in the short term, if you want to put it that way. You can ignore complexity, but it'll bite you in the end, because the resilience of the systems, the ability for people to innovate, it's much more likely to get very polarized and tense and potentially collapse than if there is this kind of much more shared leadership and an allowing of diversity and interconnectivity. So it's something, it's a big theme for me towards the end of the book. So I think yeah, it's really important about leadership.
Thanks, Jean. I'm going to come back to you, Sharon, and ask you a separate question, but it strikes me as I'm listening, I'm talking, that there are so many really brilliant thinkers. You know, from David Snowden to so many other people who've done pioneering and phenomenal work. So I suppose a lot of our understanding is emergent too, and we have to live with that as we're going through the path. But I'm just really curious, you know, if we make it a little bit more personal. I mean, Sharon, what are the what do you feel has been the most important learning or change of way you've approached the world from studying like this, and why has it helped you?
Yeah, it's a great question. Once you see the complexity of the world, you can't unsee it. So, you know, it is definitely a one-way street, people. If you kind of, you know, you can't ignore it once you've seen it. So that's one of the things. Another big aha came from reading some early drafts of Jean's new book, which is that the means may matter more than the ends. And by that, I mean how we do things may matter more than the results that we get. And I think this picks up on what Jean was just saying about power. But this is because in dynamic patterning, ends are never final. They're temporary. They're moments in time. You deliver a project, there's always another project, there's always something else going on. You know, whether that's seen as successful or not will absolutely change. But what people remember is how it was done. You know, the way we do things leaves its mark, and that changes what is more or less possible. So back to Jean's point about, Jean, I'm just going to make you the all-powerful one just for this one. So you're the all-powerful leader who is using, you know, your force, your power to get me and others in this organization to do things. And you might, you know, get stuff done, and people go, Jean's a great leader. Then what happens is we all go, well, we'll leave it to Jean, because Jean, you know, will control this for us. So at the point that Jean really needs the rest of us in the organisation to help her, because it is actually a complex challenge rather than, you know, a simple challenge that you just got to force through, we're like, A, maybe we don't trust her anymore, but B, you know, definitely we're waiting, you know, tell us the answers, and that's the problem. So the personal part of it is really thinking about, you know, those everyday things that we say and do. They have a big effect. So if we want people to be innovative and adaptive, let's give people the space and do that ourselves.
Thanks, Sharon. And we're going to pull in a couple of other people made a comment, but before that, Jean, same question for you. What's been the thing that's so personal for you in this, and how has it been useful?
Yeah, so So I, I always have two answers to a question. So I notice at least two answers to a question. So one of them is about, in a sense, the importance of mindset and the importance of worldview, that how we think shapes what we see as important, shapes what we do. So in a way, I am passionate about saying that let's understand what a complexity mindset is, and in the book, in both books, I unpick the nature of the complex world. So is there something we can understand about its general nature, this idea of patterning, emerging, the importance of context, the importance of history? You know, there are things that we can learn. It's not just saying it's all complex, get over it. So mindset matters, but it's not just mindset about the nature of the world. It's also mindset about human nature. And one of the phrases that really is associated with Taoism, but is all you know, is very much true of the complex world, is this idea of the path is made through walking. That's the phrase by Machado, I think, was it's attributed to Machado, and it's really saying that we all co-create the future collectively. It's a collective process. So what we do matters. It's what Sharon was saying about it's what we do that creates the future. It's not. It's important to have intentions, but it's what we do in search of those intentions. And you know, mindset matters about things like, you know, what's our view of human nature? Do we think people are basically selfish or stupid, in which case you have to control them? Or do you feel that people have heart, you know, that people are community minded, that they have both, you know, they can be selfish and they can be community minded? And how do we encourage and cultivate a Taoist view of how do we cultivate people to be their best selves, to perhaps think about the future and each other and the planet and everything in mind? So I think part of my answer to what do I really take from this is mindset matters. We have to both think about what we believe ourselves and where it comes from, and engage in that conversation. And it's something Sharon and I talked about. I remember us having this conversation about mindset is very practical. It sounds woolly, but if you have an idea of your own mindset about the nature of the complex world, then in a sense it's easy to pull in methods. I'm not as in this book, I'm not trying to sell you on methods. I'm trying to sell you on a worldview, and you'll find your own methods if you believe me, or if you find your own beliefs around the nature of the world. If you go and look at, is it patterned, is it emerging, you know, what can we say about it, what is human nature like? So the final thing that I think is probably the most personal for me about this is, if the path is made through walking, sometimes we're little, sometimes we're big, and sometimes we think we're little but we're big, and vice versa. But what I do matters. You know, I have to show up. One of the things that a lot of the political writers write about, who've really explored what really creates change in very difficult regimes, is about authenticity. It's about staying, you know, it's about being your best. It's about being brave. It's about showing up, speaking out, acting. And I think that that's something that I think is really important. And just, you know, when I was at STIA, the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Study, and during that visit and other visits to South Africa, I went to Robben Island, and you know, I saw where Nelson Mandela lived for 22 years. And, you know, here is an example really of someone who kept their authenticity, who didn't sell out, who didn't shop their colleagues for some more food, or, you know, think it was all over. And the chances were he would die in prison, you know, and here was this man who maintained his authenticity. And, you know, and the moment came when, you know, he's the person holding, you know, at the end of apartheid and you know, being president of South Africa. So you never know what part you're playing in it, but all you do know is that the next step you take, can you take the best step you can with authenticity, with the idea that we are collectively co-creating this this future, which hopefully will be fair, just, resilient, and sustainable. So I'll just end on that little note.
Thank you both. There's a phenomenal, obviously the idea of the path you made through walking, and you raised courage and you raised mindset, and what you both just talked about gives us, I think, some really interesting ways of thinking. I'm extremely conscious of questions that are coming up or the statements in the Q&A. Sorry, the chat's not working, the Q&A is. And I'm also conscious of the great talents we have in the audience listening. I'd like to just go to a couple of them as well. You mentioned Stellenbosch. We've got Professor Rika Prisa here, and also Associate Professor Cameron Peter from UCT. I'd like to ask them both, if you wouldn't mind, to, just, I think your mics are activated. I hope maybe Rika first. Just make a comment and ask a question, from your perspective, because you're both also very skilled and long-term researchers in this way. So Rika, with you first, please. Thank you.
And is Kamaran coming on screen at the same time? That would be nice too. And hi, Rika. Hi, good to see you.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, we were cut out a little bit when our new link came, so it might be that Kamaran was also just waiting to reconnect. Yeah, thank you very much for your invitation to be with you today, and congratulations, Jean, on a really fantastic book. Maybe as a fellow philosopher of complexity, I can just say that the contribution that Jean's book makes, not only to kind of the practical lived experience of complexity, or understanding what it means to face reality if you choose to see it as being complex, is also within the field of complexity science itself. It brings in a new tone, a new voice, a new approach that is also acknowledges the very deep, I would say, the deep roots of the thinking behind complexity science, which as it has kind of emerged over the many years as a scientific, I would say, reality, and scientific kind of explorations have shown, that reality is a lot different than just atoms and, molecules, or what we call the building block theory of reality. And through quantum theory and these, more relational sciences, there's this view that reality is fluid, it's relational, it becomes, because of its relations, things emerge and exist because of the relations. And what Jean really does here, she's actually stretched that knowledge to both ends, not only she drew from the scientific field, but then she drew it back to the roots, and it has this really deep roots in the Chinese philosophies and process philosophies, and she made that very eloquently accessible to us. And then she stretched it to the other side as well, which is for people who want to use these ideas in business or change making or in decision making. She kind of translated what does that mean as well. So she's translated from the center, which is science, to both ways, for those of us who don't have that kind of translational skills between philosophy, science, and application, as what she did. And I think that's the contribution that we as complexity philosophers or scientists really see in this book. So thank you very much for that deep work, Jean.
Thank you, Rika, and Rika and I knew each other prior to me coming to Stellenbosch, but also connected in Stellenbosch. And Rika worked with Paul Cilliers, who's one of my great heroes, well, as is Rika in her own right. But Paul wrote a book called Complexity and Postmodernism, and I think Paul with Rika, and there's a lovely book called Critical Complexity, which is edited by Rika. And one of the real themes, Rika, that I think you bring out there is the centrality of values, that values never goes away. We can never know the future, I wondered if you could perhaps just say, if this is okay with you, Jon, just ask Rika just to perhaps develop a little bit, like why are values so important? And if that's okay, Rika, you know, just talk a little bit about values, because it's such an important contribution you and Paul and your colleagues made.
Thanks, Jean. Yes, I think when you start studying complexity, people really often come to see solutions from a technical point of view. I think that if you just bring more technical understanding to complexity, it will go away. Or if you bring more knowledge or more data to a complex situation, that complexity would go away. But what we're saying that, yes, we need to do all that we can and model and, you know, get all the data and all the technical support that we can. But at the heart of it, complexity solutions are often ethical approaches. It challenges how we think about rules, who makes the rules, where do the rules come from, what do those rules assume of what it means to be human, and it basically says that you know, the ethics of complexity is not just following a recipe and then, you know, have a kind of one size fits all application to everyone everywhere, but that all the rulemaking that we do in complex situations has to be very context specific. And the process of rulemaking and deciding what is right and wrong and which values are created is a function of the interactions of the system. So it also challenges us to kind of work harder and say we need to know the contextuality of the system. We need to understand who's in the system, what are the power relations, what are the privileges, you know, who and what is being exploited, and what are these rules, how does these rules also cover those kinds of sensitivities? So I think that's really the really interesting point for me also, is to kind of translate these ideas to how we think about values and ethics, and how do we decide, you know, about power and power for who and from where and with what effect.
Yeah, brilliant. And I guess even just the ethics of what information you regard as valid, you know, where do you draw the boundaries, what do you ignore, you know, who matters, who do you listen to? Yeah, so brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
Shall we perhaps ask Kamaran to come in, Jon?
Yes, please, Kamaran. Very nice to meet you, Kamaran. And so really same question. I mean, what are your thoughts? A comment to what you've heard so far, and really, what's your take on all this, please?
Thanks, Jon. And yeah, it's people I've met by email before. I finally get to see their faces. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Firstly, I mean, I really want to just firstly congratulate Jean on this book. You know, I wasn't quite sure what to expect. A long time ago, when I was studying physics in the 90s, you know, I came across a book by Fritjof Capra, which was The Tao of Physics, and I read The Dancing Woolly Masters by Gary Zukav, where that first inspired me to really start broadening my education. And I started sitting in on fourth year postmodernism lectures in architecture, and my mind just was blown. And that's how my interest in philosophy developed. You know, I've been quite engaged with Eastern metaphysics, you know, particularly since I was a teenager. But it was through physics that I discovered philosophy, and it's, you know, things changed in my life. So what Jean has done, and which is so remarkable, is really write something transdisciplinary that can be accessed by a broad variety of people, you know, whether they're academics or intellectuals or thinkers or leaders or managers. I think the way she's written it has resonance with everyone. And that's really remarkable and very difficult to achieve, particularly with a topic like this. And so I found myself fascinated with the kind of extensive links that Jean made. It's almost an insight into how her mind works, you know. And I was truly surprised, you know, like, you know, going into like how the mind works, you know, that's the kind of thing only the great thinkers do, like your Hannah Arendt, you know, the life of the mind, someone who can sit down and explore that. And not only did she make those linkages, she'd select these really compelling quotes so that it made it more relatable, and then refer you to the readings that you needed to do if you wanted to explore further. So I think a piece of work like this, just drawing on my own experience, I just turned 50 this year, so I'm thinking a lot about my life. Some books changed the way I saw the world. And they weren't academic books, They were books that appealed to my sensibilities as a person, as a human being. And I think that's what Jean has done so impressively here. And as I read through it, I'd constantly, well, what about this? You've got your academic. And then a few pages later, Jean would deal with it. So I'd be like, oh, so what about power, And then she would deal with power. And then I was really surprised. And as we started getting to the end of the book, of how she's really grappling with the grand challenges. I mean, even discussions around degrowth versus growth, and how we can think about these things. And that's when I started to really, I'm very similar in the way my mind works. I'm relational. And I started to feel that relationality and the coherence of the book. And I think that it's going to go a long way towards inspiring people to start looking at those relations and those connections and building upon them in the way that good academic work is done, because you're inspired to, So I just wanted to say, yeah, I really thought it was massively impressive how you brought together a wide range of different ways of thinking and showed the resonances between them that we can explore. So, I'd love to have a few students look at those resonances in their degrees as well. It also appealed to me because I have a very special interest in Eastern metaphysics and have since a young age. So, this is something that's always fascinated me. And to see Jean's breakdown of Taoism, and, full disclosure, I am a Taoist practitioner, of meditation. So it was really quite something special for me to engage a bit more deeply with it as well, from someone who's actually been studying the texts. I've been more a practitioner of Taoism than, I read the Tao Te Ching, but beyond that, I haven't read much, I do have some questions, but I just want to point out one thing that I thought was so powerful that perhaps because I've been grappling with it and writing about it myself, I've got a piece coming out soon on the ethics of resistance. And this theme of path dependence that Jean brings through so beautifully in the book and locates ethics and values within that, I found to be extremely powerful. It gives me a new way of working with students to really get them to understand why means ends rationality actually really matters. And I think you did a really remarkable job of working that in so that the role of ethics and values can't be mistaken, actually.
Thank you so much, Cameron. We've only got about 15, 16 minutes left to honor time, but I'm just going to, if I may, have a look through those questions, if you wouldn't mind, if you can see them on the question. And Sharon, have you seen those questions? Is there one you'd like to pick and answer?
Yeah, there's a few amazing questions, but I'm going to go back to Gemma because she's been patient. She posted it at 4:13 at UK time. So yeah, Gemma's question was how do we see complexity informing and shaping how leaders act into the organizations that they work in? And I think it's a really good question because to bring it to life, I suppose, in a practical way, I'm really thinking about, again, if we could take change as an example, because it's probably something in the working world that we're familiar with, but we can make sweeping organizational changes. That's actually not that difficult, but we can do it in a very inhuman way. Or we can do it in a human way, and either way, I think people really remember it, and they really remember the times when it's awful. That really sticks in people's minds. You know, it erodes trust, it suppresses disagreement, it de-energizes people, and all of that makes the next change project harder. So when Gemma's asking, how does complexity and inform how leaders act, what it's doing is, you know, if we take an inhuman approach to change, it makes it more likely that that's going to continue to happen. And, you know, when that starts happening more, we get into a bit of a pattern for it, and it makes it harder for us to change the course of that. And I think that goes back to what Kamaran was saying about and Jean about path dependency. So that's the technical term. You know, we create something that then we're more likely to go with the flow. Let's get on with this project. You know, get on the bus, come with us. All of those things that, you know, feel quite inhuman in change. So it does change the context, and that affects us. Also, though, if as soon as we start to recognize that for what it is, this is patterning in motion, I think what that really means is we can choose to go against that flow as well. So, you know, if I'm running a change project, or I'm trying to create some kind of, you know, improvement in the organization, I can choose to be a little bit more human about it. And in my everyday actions and words, I can be more human, more inclusive. And, you know, Jon, I think one of the great things about that is that can also create ripple effects. So we kind of, you know, it's easy to be negative about it because people don't like to claim the negative response, you know, the negative outcomes. We like to claim the positives. But, you know, the positive stuff, those ripple effects, if I'm more human, perhaps people trust me more. Perhaps they take more risks. Perhaps they experiment. Perhaps they try things and adapt. Perhaps they follow some of those things. So, you know, perhaps that is something there. So I hope that sort of brings it to life and starts to address, I think, the question that Gemma asked, but also some of the discussion that we've heard now.
Thank you. Thanks, Sharon. There are so many good questions, and I see Gemma dropped off. Hope she comes back in a second, but that was a great answer. But it's recorded, so she'll be able to see that. Jean, you've been looking through those questions, I guess, and there's probably one or two. I mean, there's several that stick out for me, but you choose. What one would you like to answer?
Well, I wanted to weave in a bit of what Kamaran was asking me too, but one of the points I'd make that's kind of embedded in a couple of those questions is that if you have a mindset that understands the nature of the world as complex and what the science of complexity says about change, context, all these kind of words that you have to unpack and unpick, then when you've done that, when you've appraised a situation, when you've decided on the particular issues in this particular situation, then sometimes the right thing to do is to use methods. So things like, if I'm designing an organization, then a viable systems model approach is a really good way to think about it. You know, if I'm trying to understand these patterns, various systems mapping techniques are really good ways of understanding what's there. So this is not a kind of anti-method stance from Sharon and I, but it is saying that comes second to this kind of, you know, really changing your mindset about embracing complexity. And one of the ways that it does mean, though, and this is not just about using the rational mind, it's not just a left brain process. So Zelda, for example, is talking about the emotional and psychological shifts that come with it. The wisdom of complexity is a heart-mind wisdom. The Chinese have a word Zin, which means heart-mind. And Brian Goodwin, who used to be part of the Santa Fe Institute and was a biologist, but a theoretical biologist, as his career developed and he came, you know, to a new understanding, he was really interested in how do you use your intuition and your imagination and your body even to understand the patterns. He was talking about, you know, what's if you're looking at a wood, you know, how do you have a sense of what does it mean to say, does this ecology have edges? You know, what does that mean? What is the pattern? What are its boundaries? He talks about how if you're dealing with health, you know, if you approach health issues systemically, then how do you attune doctors and dentists? I've had this conversation with my dentist who sent me lots of papers on this. There's a bit in my book about dentistry, believe it or not. You know, how do you teach people to use their broader senses critically, to bring in the word that Kamaran used, that are both right brain and left brain, are kind of intuitive, holistic, able to weave, able to find judgments, that is more about using the right brain, not just using the left brain. It's not to leave out the quantitative and the rational, but there's something beyond reason that you get into. And that also translates into leadership, because if I use an example in my book, and Sharon's got similar examples, where you come into a room and stuff is going on, you're perhaps the facilitator or the boss, and you're trying to kind of sense what's going on in this room. You know, it's not just an issue of reason. You can't analyze it. There's no tool I can use in a sense. I'm tuning in to the flow in the room. And maybe if I'm skillful, I have a sense, here's an opportunity to speak. You know, here's an opportunity to say, look, I can see how hard this is, you know, for you, or you're looking upset here, you know, but that is part of the weaving of the future, is to actually respond to the emotional and the psychological issues that are there. And any good leader knows that. But you're in a sense using your left brain, right brain, your heart and your mind to apprehend the flow. It's like a jazz musician. Anybody who plays jazz, you know, when you get in tune, when you're in the flow, you can join a piece of music and know how to do that. And it's the same with leadership. So I think what I'm trying to say about tools is, yes, they have their place, and I certainly use tools. You know, I'm a theoretical physicist. I've done sums, you know, and models, you know, I'm not frightened of them. It's not, I don't shy away from them because they're difficult. It's just having this other kind of quality and valuing judgment and intuition. And it was very interesting, you know, knowing Brian Goodwin later on in his life, you know, coming from a similar stable to myself, how he really felt that we should be developing in dentistry, in medicine, in leadership, a much more intuitive sense of what's going on. And it can be critical, as Kamaran said, meaning sometimes you work with lots of people, you have an idea of critical subjectivity, where you're bringing together many views and you're testing yourself and you're being challenged, and you start to home in on an understanding of both what is there and what is changing. They're two, and the musician again knows that. You've both got to notice what the pattern is, and then you've got to have a way of subtly changing that pattern. That's the way you're developing the path that's emerging. So Zelda, that was partly I'm answering Kamara and partly picking up on Zelda's comment.
Could I add to that, because I think it also ties into another one of the questions, and you know that it's not that intuition is better, but I think one of the things, you know, that we're trying to say in our different ways is, if you look at a situation in one way, you are going to miss a lot. And so, you know, different perspectives on situations. So if you're only rational, if you're kind of, you know, only looking at the numbers, that really is just going to be part of the picture. So often in the working world, I think what gets underplayed sometimes is the emotional, the psychological, the creative. I think Clark's question asked about artistry. Absolutely. Whatever we can do to get out of set minds, you know, this is the tunnel vision that I'm really fearful about. And you know, Ami's asked an amazing question, which is, given that we co-create the future, why have we created the current unsustainable, unequal society? I mean, that's the question to ask. And I don't think we've done it deliberately. I think we've done it, you know, collectively out of lots of small choices and habits. So anytime that we don't question the status quo, we're reinforcing the status quo. So that kind of more straightforward example I gave about change, are we more human or more inhuman in how we're engaging with change in organizations, in societies, and so on? Bit by bit, this changes. Nobody created climate change deliberately. Nobody created inequality, or, you know, deliberately, but people play into that. They might see it serves their ends, but I think it's about choices. So let's pay attention to the patterns that we are creating together.
I'm guessing, Jean, that's a beautiful answer to the question I was going to pick up. Sorry, I dropped off there because of whatever. But I saw Jean's body language saying she had a comment on that one. I'm quite sure. I know, Jean. Yeah.
It's about power. I mean, you know, I'm not disagreeing with Sharon, but part of my answer to Ami's question is, you know, leadership is not just, this is not just a kind of emergent, be nice, let's all be ethical and hug each other, you know, ethic. You know, that the free market perspective is a view that people are basically selfish, but if you all get them to fight each other long enough, the best will happen for everybody, and it doesn't. You know, what happens is that the rich get richer and the powerful get more powerful, and that's why it's because people, some people are just want power, you know, and if you don't. If you don't believe me, I'll look at some of what's going on, and you know, around the world. It is. We have to challenge that power early. That's one of what the political things is. We've got to call it out early, and we also have to have institutional processes that are laws, that are enforced laws, and that minimise this tendency with some people to just want to win and want to have power. So it is part of human nature. It's not the whole of human nature, but leadership in a complex world is not just about a kind of emergent, let's see what happens. It's also about saying institutionally, what do we need to do, and how do we need to stand up? So that was partly what I was responding to. And if I may just say a little bit more, which is Cobus's question about how do you get to know about this stuff, you know, what's your way in? And this is a bit this won't work for everybody, but you know, as you know, one of the models that comes out of social sciences is the idea that there are three levels. There's ontology, epistemology, and methodology. And what I'm talking about a lot is this idea of what's the world like really, this ontological frame that's a starting point. And I think ways into understanding that that complex ontological starting point. I like Edgar Morin. I think some of what I've tried to write is trying to clarify that understanding of what the world's like. I think there's then the next question is about how do you get to know about this complex world, and what kind of methodologies are there? And if you start too soon with the methodologies, you're kind of missing the bit about the changing worldview, because what Edgar Morin points out very clearly is that for some people, what complexity is about, it's about managing it and making it more knowable. So it's kind of still within a kind of mechanical classical physics, classical science frame. It's about pulverizing the complexity into a manageable ways of looking at it, which isn't bad, but you have to know that's what you're doing, and actually say, what are we missing by doing that, and how do we live with the kind of the broader understanding of this complex world that isn't just saying, as I used to say to my mum, you know, it's not just saying everything's complex, it's saying the world shows up in flowing, changing patterns of relationships where new things emerge. And then if we understand the particular question we have, which is, how do I run this project? How do I design this organization? How do I oppose this leadership? Then that's when the methodologies, and of which there are many, and there are some good ones, come in. So that would be my answer, Cobus. Get them thinking about the broader picture first before we move people into the so what do you do about it, which can often be quite methodological and still quite scientific in some cases.
So we're keen to answer all these questions, but we're going to hand back to Jon because we're at the end, aren't we, Jon?
We're running out of time. We have another time. And Kamar, and thank you very much for in the background there, been answering these questions, doing your great sterling work in the background. Thank you very much for that.
Enrico too.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rico and Prisca. Thank you so much. I'm really taken by this. Thank you both very much. I've got a few questions. One of the ones I would come up with in my own mind is, while we talk abstractly, and I absolutely believe and understand to a high degree about the need to focus on ontology, the nature of the world. We see the world as we are, not as it is. So let's understand what we are as well. I'm also struck by, as I watch Ralph Stacey's path through this journey, writing on complexity theory, then writing on creativity, and then writing on challenge system thinking. And I remember being very taken by one of his models, and I just happened to bump into him at a hotel in Sydney. And I said, Ralph, I love your creativity web. He said, oh, that, yes, I've moved on from that, he said. And I said, oh, no, I've just taught a whole course on that. I thought, yeah. And then he dived into improv, and he dived into the Tavistock Institute, deep process work. And this was his journey, working with creativity and improv, etc. So I think there's so much underlying it, but I'm left with one question at the end, which is, while we talk about this in abstract ways in the concrete world, are we activist enough? And does this enable us to be activists in a world that we see has got some mega challenges at the moment that we want our kids and families and friends to grow up into? So I wonder about that. And you mentioned the nature of courage. But I'm going to thank you both very much because we're out of time. Really interesting. I hope we're going to do more of these. I see Sonia Blinio was here earlier on. Her dog got sick, so she's had to rush off to the vet, unfortunately. But she works a lot with David Snowden. Another very interesting take on this. I'd love to have that debate and different points of view, but I'd love to also see some people who are applying this in their work at the time and some of your case studies from that. But thank you both very much. Thank you for your contribution to this field and the wonderful work you're doing. It's absolutely marvelous and great books. Jean, hold up Sharon's latest book. I'm going to hold up yours, please. There it is. There's the Tao of Complexity. Please get that. It's on Amazon. There we are. There are the books. And if you're quick, you can actually get a 30% off with code leadership and code G. Yeah, take a screenshot, everybody, quickly with your camera, and then you can get your discounts on that. I've certainly got one. I'm very delighted. But thank you for this. It's been great. And both of you, what a marvelous contribution you make. And thank you so much for everybody for attending. Really nice to see you here. I'm sorry we didn't get all of your questions, but a really phenomenal group of people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jon, as well. Thank you for hosting us and inviting us.
That's a pleasure. That's a pleasure. I shall go on the streets of Morocco now and enjoy dinner out with a nice tagine. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Well, it's so nice to have this post-session conversation with you, Jean, because it flew past, didn't it?
Yeah, no, definitely. No, it was. Yes, it really did go very fast, and there were so many good questions and other things to talk about, weren't there? So
yeah, and so what we decided to do, everybody that's watching, we thought we would record our conversation afterwards, because we want to pick up some of the great questions that you asked that we didn't have a chance to get to in the session a little bit earlier. So think of it as bonus material.
Yes, and we're going to take hopefully about 20 minutes or so just to cover some of the questions and a few other things. And I wanted to start really, Sharon, with your book, which came out, was it 2021? Yeah,
It was, yeah.
2021. And I got asked to review it at the time, and it is a lovely book. And what I've always felt about it is that we come from the same starting point in many ways, that our ideas about patterning and, you know, the need to notice things as they emerge, all those kind of things we're not disagreeing with each other and on the fundamentals. But what I like about your book is I think you make it very practical for practicing managers and leaders without losing any of that kind of nuance and kind of subtlety that's really important for this. And I love some of your headings, like interpreting reality in flight, which I just think captures that idea of we've got to stay with things as they emerge, and noticing what is changing. Better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. I really like it. But I just wanted to ask you, really, what do you think your book is contributing to this whole field? You know, how would you describe it for yourself?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And, you know, I want to link back to one of the questions that we were asked, actually. So Cobus asked, what are good ways into complexity? And, you know, I guess that's what I had in mind when I was writing the book, because I'm on a bit of a mission, which is to, I think complexity, you know, what comes from complexity science is so amazing and really practical and useful. And one of my concerns is it's kind of relegated to the margins in management. It's seen as a bit of an alternative. And, you know, you're either fully in or you're not in at all. And I thought, well, that's less than helpful, to be really honest. So what I'm trying to do with my book is to I suppose make complexity less overwhelming. So the way I've tried to do that is, first of all, focus on the working world, because I think that can be a bit more manageable, a bit more human scale to start to think about complexity in that domain. It's not the edges, but it's a kind of nice familiar size, and then really getting into complexity through some of the challenges. So things that you know, so many managers and professionals are kind of struggling with: staying on top of things, keeping up with things, and you know, knowing what to do. They end up being really practical challenges. So I kind of start with that and then sprinkle in some of the theory and the science around complexity. And I've tried to be really straightforward about it, but not dumb it down. So, you know, we're not hiding from complexity. And then, yeah.
And if you gave just one, you know, or two examples, like if I'm a leader and I go to your book, what's it going to tell me? Tell me like three things it tells me to do that would be different than if I was not coming from a complexity perspective.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we've talked about already, which is the mindset. And this is so important. So I've got an idea that I bring in chapter 4 called mental aperture, which just says open your mind to a little bit more of the complexity. It doesn't have to be everything. And I think we talked about that. So I'd say that is really key, because as soon as we open up slightly, then we can start to engage. The second point is to really notice what's going on at the edges, the not quiteness around, you know, if you're focusing on a particular piece of work or a project or something like that. What's connected to it, and what's surprising, what's puzzling, what's unexpected. So, you know, this is you know, we talked about this as noticing, and I think noticing is something that's very practical to bring into our everyday. It doesn't have to be done separately. We can do that. And then, you know, you asked for a third, and I think, you know, the third thing would be, you know, choosing our responses. So being choiceful in complexity, even though we may not be perfectly right, but we can kind of adapt as we go. So I've tried to make it really introductory and, you know, hopefully accessible for those in particular the working world.
Yeah, because and I think, you know, just sort of thinking of that question for myself too, it's a bit like you'd say to somebody, well, of course, you know, plan, do what you're doing, but review it more often, or spend more time noticing what's actually is working or is not working, or what's new in the field. So it can be, you know, you don't have to use long words around it as you don't. It's kind of, you know, it has got a sort of pragmatism about it, or experiment with more than one thing, you know, have a portfolio approach, because some things might work better than you expected, some things might not work, you know, work as well, or have more contingency. So if you need to change direction, you're not sort of surprised by it. So it's trying to make it like that, isn't it? That it's a both and, you know, do what you're doing anyway, but just ask a few more questions.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry, I'm about to go off on a great, I was thinking about, I'll just say this, but I think we should go back to the questions. Is I think sometimes people hear complexity as forcing leaders to be very tentative, whereas sometimes it's still about being bold, but it's
Absolutely.
like, do it. I remember a colleague saying to me once, instead of doing ready, aim, fire, you do ready, fire, aim. And it's a bit like, do things, you know, be bold, but then, you know, maybe you will modify it, or maybe it won't quite work as you expected. But I don't think we're saying, are we, that this is a recipe for tentativeness, or, you know, meditating while something not interesting emerges. There's a bit of that, but it's also about, you know, lead, you know, have a vision, go for it, but be prepared to listen and see what works. So,
yeah, very much. And, you know, be certain about uncertainty. Don't be, well, it might be uncertain. No, the world definitely is uncertain. And, you know, we're going to try things. We're going to see how they work. We're really going to notice what else is going on. We're going to expect to adapt as we go. We won't deliver things exactly as planned. I think, you know, we shouldn't hide from that, and absolutely agree with you. It's not tentative in that way. There is something about being tentative though, and, you know, I wonder if this links with Priya Bash's question, so which was, what is the biggest challenge facing South African corporates in using complexity science approaches when trying to solve business problems? Now, you know, if we can sort of broaden it out to corporates, you know, more generally, I suspect that point you've just raised about, is it a bit tentative and wishy-washy, will not go down well in many corporate spheres, because there is that, I think, conditioning that we should be in full control. I mean, that's what management means. Pressure for answers, ticking things off, being certain. I think those things are prized. And, you know, perhaps the other one I would add is, you know, this thing about being very time poor, or thinking we're very time poor because we're trying to get on top of everything and deal with things and deliver things, and you know, that's, I think they really get in the way. What would you say about that, Jean?
Yes, I think that you know, in South Africa and elsewhere, there is a prize of certainty. You're supposed to know, and you know, you're not you know, there's a sense in which you're not paid to say, well, I'm not quite sure, let's try it and see. And one of the questions that I ask managers is, you know, you've been involved in strategy, you know, let's say we've got a group of managers together, you've been involved in strategy, how often does it go to plan? And of course, everybody just kind of rolls their eyes, and most people, not everybody, but most people say, well, in the main, it doesn't go to plan. And you then ask, why not? and they tell you all the kind of reasons about the changing context, new entrants, you know, analysis that didn't take into account certain emerging factors that were unknown unknowns, all those things, all the reasons that that the world is complex and things don't tend to go to plan. And then if I ask the question, well, okay, well, you're stuck with your strategy process, you know, that's what's expected of you. How can you modify it a bit to make more sense of the complex world? Then they start to feel more comfortable, and it's more about, well, let's review it more often. The things I was saying before, let's have more contingency. So it does link to that further question, which is, how do you unlearn? And I think that was Jane's question, wasn't it?
Yes.
Which is really to do with finding the kind of questions that allow people to explore that the truth of this certainty isn't really there, to actually be able to say it out loud. It's the same with impact assessment. If you say, well, you know, you're trying to prove what your project contributed, but were there other projects going on? How certain are you, you know, what were the myriad of factors that created your project to have some success? But, you know, is it only that you can attribute some of that to your project? Were there other contributing factors, or were there reasons why it didn't work? So you broaden the conversation. Now, when you do that, you know, people are very comfortable. That makes sense. And it's a sense that the corporate world expects you to play a certain game about, I'm certain this strategy will work, or I'm certain this is the evidence that this project had this impact. And if you can take this sort of slightly looser role and say, well, we can't give up on these processes, but we can start, and it is a way of unlearning. And it's often through just ordinary questions to people, where they start to, in a sense, be allowed to say, we're not really sure, you know, this is a really strong innovation and we'd be better to treat it more tentatively. So that would be, what would you say about that, Sharon? How do you think you unlearn?
Yeah, and I think if you think about unlearning, you know, it's almost going back to this point about, do we flip from sort of management to complexity, you know, control to not in control? And I, you know, that's totally unrealistic to think that would work. All of our routines of the working world, whether we like it or not, are embedded. Our language is embedded in this idea of management control. So if we just throw that up in the air, we lose all of that, and there will be some good parts of that we're going to want to take with us. And I think, you know, that was part of Jane's question as well, which is about, you know, what is worth retaining. So, you know, this idea of unlearning being, you know, this massive disruption where we throw away everything we had. I don't think it works that way, and I don't think it's a good idea. But I do think we can unlearn by opening up our perspective. So, you know, if what we've been doing is too narrow, then by opening up, we can learn new things, and that will evolve our learning, rather than kind of, you know, sort of take the brain out and put another brain in, or, you know, totally change. You talked about rules of the game. Imagine if you totally change all the rules of the game.
Yeah, no, completely. And I felt Jane was talking about history, you know, you throwing away history. Well, there is a sense that we would talk about with path dependency that you don't throw away history. I mean, it's there whether you like it or not. You know, some of our attitudes, some of the processes that exist, and I think it has to be a more subtle change. You know, that if there is huge power in control, which of course there is, people don't like giving up on control, and sometimes you feel they'd rather control things even if they know it won't work. They don't want to release that control and have a more collective approach, or a portfolio approach, or whatever it is. But history's there whether we like it or not, and we've got to evolve from history as opposed to unlearn, because it'll come back to bite us if we just try and ban it or banish it with a new set of rules, as you say. So I thought it was a very interesting question from Jane. I thought that was quite good.
Yeah, it was. And there's another interesting question. This is from somebody who stays anonymous, but thank you for this question. So what will the impact of AI on complexity be?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's. Do you want to go first, or do you want me to say something?
You go first.
Well, I did think about this. I wrote a section on this in the Tao of Complexity, and I think that, you know, one of the things that AI type methods, you know, big data analysis can do, because the approach that we've tended to take, as I understand it, in AI has been very much based on data, that, you know, finding patterns in huge data, and it does find patterns in huge data that couldn't have been seen. So, you know, if an AI system reads an MRI scan, you know, there will be you know, ways you might want to have a human view as well, but there's ways in which the human is really supported by finding patterns in the data, and we're all about patterns. I always think that complexity is you know, is about both understanding the patterns that are there, but also noticing what is dissolving, what is emerging, what's changing. So there's this sort of both and view, but understanding patterns is important. But the issues that, as I see it with AI, is first of all, it's normative. It tends to, because it's analysing past data, then it's biased by what was in the data. You know, one example is, you know, if you ask it to do some recruitment and you give it a lot of past data, it'll tend to preference white men, you know, because if in particular companies, you know, if that's been the norm. So it's normative as opposed to dealing with the emerging future. It's very difficult for it to in the way it's constructed at the moment. You've always got to be careful with AI because things are changing, but it's difficult for it to deal with something that's it's never seen. The other issue that I think is very interesting is to do with the way that the human mind can make value judgments, or the human heart mind can make value judgments. And there's a lovely book by Ian McEwan, a novel called Machines Like Us, which kind of tries to capture this, you know, how we can balance, you know, if we're trying to make judgments between the importance of climate change versus the importance of poverty versus the importance of inequality, or we're trying to imagine what it means to address love in the situation. We humans can intuitively make judgments between unlike things, whereas that's much harder for an AI. So I feel that you know, and I may be wrong, but there's something about the kind of emerging future and about the need for intuitive judgment that's harder for a machine to do. And you know, maybe we watch this, Sharon, in 5 years and go, oh well, you know, look what they've done now. So what do you think? How would you add to that?
Well, I'm kind of slightly worried it's more 5 minutes than 5 years, because, you know, it's already changing how we're working in the workplace and you know, outside of work. So I was chatting just a couple of days ago about performance feedback and appraisals, and I know people are getting AI to write, you know, their feedback for themselves, their feedback for others, and of course there's a really, you know, part of that works really well. You know, if I've got a few ideas and I put them into a generative AI, you know, say make it sound better, it can absolutely do that. So kind of, you know, there's this relationship that's already going on, and then I get that back and then I can work on that, you know. And this is so we've got, I think, you know, this idea of feedback loops, cause and effect, become a lot more entangled.
Yeah.
Of course, the other way that it can happen is I could just say, look, I can't be bothered to think what to write. You know, I've been asked to give you feedback. You know, I want to say you're doing a good job, and I just outsource the job to AI, and then that comes in, and then, you know, that starts to be the norm. So I think there is something about AI that is already happening right now, which means that complexity is becoming more complex. Things are becoming more entangled, and we can't go back. So this is definitely already happening. So we need to be even more careful to notice unintended consequences. So what else is happening while we're kind of, all having a jolly time, outsourcing, some of the less interesting stuff to some very accessible tools. They're in the workplace, we've all got access to them today. What patterns are we creating that are broader than that? So I do think that's it's key. We don't know the future, so we've got to be looking even more curiously at how we are creating patterns as, sort of large groups of humans.
Yeah. And the thing about values and ethics and intentions and dealing with an emerging future that it's never seen before, and how it's only recourse to ethics is what is in the data sets that it's using. So it's just, I mean, spoiler alert, the glossary for my book, we started with, we asked it to read the book and write a glossary. We gave it keywords, and it was about 70% good, and then some of it was rubbish, and 70% of it just needed some reworking. But it was a great help. But if I'd have left it to it, it would have been a problem. I know we're running out of time a bit. I don't know, do you think we've got time for the question about the importance of self-awareness, or should we leave it at that and wrap up? What do you think?
Well, I'm thinking we leave that open for future debate. I'm really hoping that people have enjoyed this bonus material, and if you have, please let us know. So one of the ways that you can contact us is through our websites. So you'll see those coming up on the screen now. So Jean's website is embracingcomplexity.com, and mine is spaceforlearning.com. So, if you like this bonus material, if you want more of this, if you'd like us to record some more conversations, let us know, and maybe we will. If you want to delve more into these ideas, the publisher is currently offering 30% off both the books. So take a quick screenshot and you'll get the QR codes and also the discount codes. What have I missed, Jean?
I think that's about it. It's quite nice to have a more relaxed chat, isn't it? And to explore some things. And I guess if you you don't have to agree with any of this. We're still open for questions. So if this gets posted and you want to ask more questions or come back and disagree with us, then feel free. It's an opening up rather than and anything else, I think. So thank you. It's been good, Sharon, to have another chat. And I think shall I stop recording now? I think we're coming to an end. So hope you enjoy it, everybody.